Greetings, and since the Highguard release, there was something in the back of my mind that just came back to the forefront on this very day. And so I kind of just want to yap a bit about it here in this video. And that is the argument that a game made by former big names from a studio, whether that's a former well-known studio or any kind of big company, that specific marketing lie that so many trailers and previews want you to believe doesn't really translate into success, and less people actually take that argument seriously. So let's take a look at some of the more popular examples and then talk about why putting big former names in your studios and games marketing really isn't a recipe for success in any way, shape or form, but yet it seems that studios and their marketing teams tried that specific stick again and again to no real success or avail. First of all, let's talk about a few of these games that really didn't turn out to be high successes. First of all, we have Highguard, which obviously was made by former Apex and Titanfall devs, and we see a few of the influences from them in the game, but when compared to these, especially to Titanfall, if you expected anything Titanfall related from Highguard, you are probably severely disappointed. So the question is then, why put that kind of pedigree into the marketing? It's probably just because there are big names, possibly big names. We don't know what these people did at their specific studio that they worked in. We don't know what they did when working for Apex Legends on Respawn or when they were developing Titanfall. We don't even know what positions these devs were in. Next one obviously is the much bigger failure, that being Concord, even though Highguard is kind of being compared to Concord as well, but I think Concord is like the pinnacle of failure. Concord was made by ex-Bungie and ex-Activision developers. Not just developers, we're talking about generally roles within a studio. So if ex-people from is being put in a marketing campaign, that means it could be ex-developers, ex-marketing, ex-sales, ex-HR, or some sort of management position as well. And Concord turned out to be a really uninspired nothing burger of a product. Literally one of those fake games that play in the background in like a movie or something. And that was made by ex-Bungie and Activision developers, supposedly. Then we have the Callisto Protocol, another very, I would argue, disappointing release. It wasn't really a big tragedy such as Concord, but it wasn't really what people expected from ex-Visceral devs. Very prominent ex-Visceral developers in management positions made Callisto Protocol, very big names involved, and really didn't turn out to be a much beloved or good game. I mean, do you remember Callisto Protocol? I don't think a lot of people even remember this game's release because it was kind of just uninspired. Then we got a very old one, that's, if you even remember it to this day, Mighty No. 9, made by Inafune, the so-called father of Mega Man, and you know, you probably remember the shitty line from the trailer that everybody made fun of.
And make the bad guys cry like an anime fan on prom night.
That really didn't turn out to be a good game at all anyway. So you have a big giant name in your studio developing a callback to the original Mega Man games, supposedly a spiritual successor, and then it failed on every single point where it could become some sort of spiritual successor. Then we got Back 4 Blood, made by supposedly the original Left 4 Dead developers. You know, not taking into account that most of that team was purchased by Valve and not a lot of the original developers actually are still with Turtle Rock Studios. And then once again, we don't know what roles the ex-Left 4 Dead developers actually were holding when they made Left 4 Dead 1. We had no idea what these people did. Were they high-leveling developers? Were they leads? Were they concept designers? We have no idea. So just putting made by Left 4 Dead developers in the marketing is a nice little gag, but it doesn't really translate into Back 4 Blood being a good product. And as it turned out, even though the game wasn't really horrible, it really wasn't the Left 4 Dead killer it was supposed to be. I remember when this game came out and people were making fun at the expense of Left 4 Dead Dead, which usually happens when something like this is being developed and put onto the market. It's a little bit disappointing that success always needs to become at the expense of another product. Can we just leave Left 4 Dead 1 and 2 alone and have Back 4 Blood stand on its own? Anyway, Back 4 Blood didn't really go anywhere, and then at the end of it, people made fun of it because it really didn't kill Left 4 Dead, which is really difficult to do. Killing Team Fortress, Left 4 Dead and other Valve games is pretty fucking difficult, and maybe that shouldn't be the goal of your release. Then we have a rather weird, maybe niche game that you've probably also forgotten about, which is Balan Wonderworld. Not a really important release, but it was totally garbage when it was released to the public. Made by two of the original Sonic the Hedgehog creators. Then you wonder, how do two of the big names from Sonic the Hedgehog make a product like this that is just complete garbage? Well, the answer is gonna come later, but I'm gonna just give you a few more examples. Stormgate, former Blizzard developers. Nightingale, former BioWare developers. Immortals of Avium, former Sledgehammer Games and again Visceral developers. Lawbreakers, do you remember Lawbreakers? Former Gears of War developers and studio heads. Keep in mind, when I say former personalities, these include literal studio managers, directors, big names that were then studio heads at that point in time, who completely botched the launch of their own product. Then we have Godus, made by Peter Molyneux, and if you know anything about Fable, that name is really prevalent in your mind at this point in time, because we know how much of a visionary Peter Molyneux is. A very strange visionary, and one of the biggest issues with games that he's been developing, which we will be talking about later on. Then we got an oldie, but maybe even a goodie, Kingdoms of Amalur, a game that I don't think is that bad, but was made by former Oblivion developers and again studio leads, which just didn't turn out to be lucrative or popular, but overall not really a bad game, but you know, kind of sunk into obscurity. Then there's Crucible. Crucible, famously Amazon Games poaching a bunch of ex-Bungie, Valve developers and many more, and that really didn't help the game at all. Amazon Games being a very cautionary tale of just poaching big names from other studios does not lead to success if you lack the overhead management to direct these people in order to make a good game. Then we got a few more funny examples, one being Firefall, made by Mark Kern, probably the single most annoying ex-Blizzard developer who never actually made anything of value since he left Blizzard, besides being absolutely annoying on social media. And then lastly, Wayfinder. Wayfinder being a bit of a tragic tale because that was made by former Darkside developers. Didn't look too interesting, to be honest, but these are products where it isn't even satisfying to see them fail. It's just kind of sad, because Wayfinder wasn't really a game that was hyped, overhyped, marketed, or had any kind of controversy around it. It was just kind of a game that came and went and didn't make an impact. Now I want to talk about a few other examples before we get into the why. Other examples why we see a decline in game quality, and that is, firstly, the game was handed over from the original developers to another studio, either on the behest of an investor or because the original developers sold their product or any other reason, and then the sequels became way worse. The prime example being Little Nightmares, made by Supermassive Games, not necessarily a name that is in any way, shape or form negative in the gaming industry, but Little Nightmares 3 really wasn't what people were expecting to be. Little Nightmares 3 really wasn't up to par with the older games, and it wasn't what people were expecting and hoping for. It's a very shallow and disappointing sequel made by a studio that doesn't even have a bad reputation, but that tells you that just handing over the product to a different cast, group and studio, it doesn't necessarily lead to success, because there is a certain composition of team, visionary, management, planning, and it's all stuff that we will be talking about later on. Then we got Silent Hill, a very long-running issue, basically anything that's post Team Silent. Most of the releases that came after Team Silent no longer worked on Silent Hill were way less than the original Silent Hill games. Some of the more modern Silent Hill games being outright bad, horrific. Then we have Metal Gear Survive, famously, does anybody remember Metal Gear Survive? It's an absolute garbage fire that was made after Metal Gear 5 released, completely made by Konami without any of the input of the original creators or studios anymore, and wouldn't you know it, didn't really turn out to be a good game. To be honest, the concept in itself wasn't that good of an idea anyway, so tough choice. Then we have Thief 2014, very famously, pretty much one of the earliest examples of the modernization trope in video games, modernization of a beloved game franchise into absolute trash. What I mean here by modernization in quotation marks is absolutely dumbing down the experience and the gameplay aspect of the original Thief games. If you've played the original Thief, you know that they are very open, map design, exploration based, and obviously, I hate to use this specific genre term, but they were a sort of immersive sims, and Thief 2014 being a very railroaded, linear experience with a bunch of hallmarks of game modernization. Only specific points where you can use your hookshot. Very, very stupid enemy AI, extremely lazy map design, repeated animation locking, opening up cupboards to loot like a singular piece of jewelry out of a random cupboard. Your character being like an absolute kleptomaniac, grabbing everything they can from like spoons and knives to sell in order for him to gain like upgrades. It was like one of the first games that I played where I really experienced what people mean by dumbing down, making something worse, making something less of a quality product. Thief 2014, one of the biggest, earliest examples of a beloved franchise being handed over to some studio that has no idea what they're doing with the original IP. Then we have Mass Effect Andromeda, not even being made by the original BioWare team. A huge mistake, making a Mass Effect game and then not handing it to the original BioWare team. They were busy with Anthem at that point in time. And then BioWare Montreal made Mass Effect and completely fucked up that game. And then we know what happened to Mass Effect Andromeda and the Montreal team in the aftermath of the release of this game. Then we have Duke Nukem Forever, a game in development hell for eternity, coming out being an overall mediocre product made by Gearbox. Not one of the best releases, I would argue. That's Duke Nukem Forever, and Alien Colonial Marines is one of the two big Gearbox blunders. And then we also take into account studios that fell off, such as Volition, for example. Volition making high quality products. If you don't remember the original Conflict Free Space game, the really excellent space simulation, space combat games that they made, and then the early Saints Row games, and then you look at Volition in current year and what they put out with their last Saints Row release, and you really see what happened to that studio. Obviously, one of the reasons is a lot of the people working at Volition are very likely not the people that used to work there when they made games like Saints Row 1, 2, or Free Space 1 and 2. And then we have, to round it all off, all of the shallow remasters and remakes that were given to some game studio that has no clue how and why the original game had success in the first place. But in these examples, we do understand at least why companies shift studio responsibility over and hand off beloved franchises to other studios, because they want to make a quick buck, they want to cash in on nostalgia, they want to cash in on remake culture, and maybe rug pull some of the normies that don't know or haven't played the original game and they have no clue about the history of the franchise or the product. But why do so many aspiring and newly founded studios fail, even though they consist of industry veterans, supposed industry veterans, and or former highly valued developers and big names? Well, here is why. And if you've thought about this in any way, shape or form, what you're about to hear is nothing really new to you, but maybe there's something to be learned from that. And possibly the consequence that you should take from what I'm about to talk about here is, maybe if you see that label of game is made by X and Y from studio something, that is not at all an indicator whether the game is going to be good or bad. First of all, the original dev team is largely and very likely not the same as it was when they made their original beloved title. Throughout the years, and especially if there are big gaps in between game releases, there was significant, very likely significant brain drain and talent loss at the studios. The big thinkers, the household names, and the visionary that made the studio great are very likely gone. But just having visionary visionaries at your studio doesn't mean you will be successful. Examples of brain drain and talent loss being Turtle Rock Studios. For example, they are not really made up of the developers that made Left 4 Dead 1. Therefore, them making Back 4 Blood doesn't necessarily translate into success just because they were the original studio that made Left 4 Dead. Because the studio is no longer made up of the specific team that came together to make Left 4 Dead 1. Another good example is GSC, the makers behind the original Stalker games. This studio largely was poached, or let's say the members of GSC largely left for A4 Studios to make the Metro games. The modern GSC games are no longer the old developers, they are no longer the old team that made the original Stalker games, which is also why Stalker 2 has disappointed so many of the original Stalker fans. In fact, some of the reports that I was able to find say that almost half of the original GSC studio have joined 4A games throughout the years. So that means there is like a 50% brain drain and talent loss at GSC. So the GSC that made Stalker 2 isn't at all the studio that made Stalker 1 or the original Stalker titles. This is one of the explanations why Stalker 2 feels significantly different than all of the previous games and why it couldn't reach the same milestone or the same intrigue. And this is why a lot of people take Stalker Gamma, for example, and say that this is way more of a faithful Stalker 2 than Stalker 2 could actually be. And the big question is, can that conglomeration of GSC studios ever make a truly Stalker 2, like a spiritual successor to the original Stalker game? Is that even possible with their current makeup of their team members? So that's the first reason. The original dev teams don't consist of the people that used to work there anymore. But where do these people go? Let's say the visionaries of a former studio leaves and makes their own. Well, in this case, former developers likely maybe becoming some sort of studio founder and he's in a managing position. And a lot of former devs becoming managers then kill their own product and their own project and their own dev studio with scope creep and a severe lack of leadership knowledge. Instead of maybe handing over the management of the studio to some chosen person that is capable of leading a studio, these former developers who have no real industry experience as studio heads and studio leaders, they now have to lead a studio, not just develop a game. They might have been a good developer, they might have been a good lead developer even, but do they make a good studio head and do they have good leadership potential? That is the biggest question that we have to ask, and it turns out in a lot of cases they fail at that aspect. These developers also might not have ever had any significant role to play at their older studios. A lot of times when we read this game is made by a team of former developers from X or Y, we have no indications of what developers those actually are. We don't know if they were just concept artists, basic level developers, lead developers, what did they develop, how involved were they in the products, what were they visionaries or not, what kind of decision-making process did they have, how important was their contribution to the original titles. We have no indication of their actual pedigree. We only know that they used to work at a beloved studio that has at one point made good games in the past. That is no indication though that this setup and this team is then going to move on to make good games in the future. What did these people actually do at the studio that they worked at? They might have just as well been a random janitor, an HR worker, or some sort of marketing guy. And now they're at a different studio, supposedly doing something great, but we have no idea what that is. Then sometimes you have the other example where it's a sales manager or a marketing manager that jumps off of one studio and then is founding a new studio. Now then the problem is that these guys don't have any actual development knowledge. They don't have any idea how to actually make a game. They only know how to market a game. And then you end up with really good marketing, but then in the background, there isn't really an actual good game present there because it's all kind of marketing. You know, these people know how to be good at sales, to get funding, to have like a lead plan, how to make a game. But then they struggle to deliver on the final product because they lack other leadership skills. That's the biggest bane of small studios or aspiring studios, the kind of lack of talent that they are faced with. And then we have a situation where we have one visionary, and I put visionary in big quotation marks here, and we can take Peter Molyneux as an example. We have one visionary and then a bunch of yes men hired by said visionary that then drive the project into the ground. Cult of personality studios are really, really bad. Peter Molyneux comes to mind, where his vision definitely contributed a lot to the downfall of the final product and the games that he released. And it is especially bad if a visionary doesn't get any pushback for their vision, because that is in large part and can be in large part a catalyst of what might be ruining a product in the long run. And then we have to talk about where success is actually being attributed to. Who claims success? We know it's always the studio heads, but success is only ever attributed to the studio lead, the talking head, but not the team. And this is really important. We forget that it's not just the talking head in all the interviews that made the great game. Maybe even great games were made and actually succeeded in spite of that person's leadership and not because of it. We have to keep that in mind. Not every leader, not every studio lead, not every studio director is a good director and leader. A lot of times, maybe despite that person being incompetent, a product turns out to be great. And then that success is being attributed to that talking head, to the one name. Mismanagement is one of the biggest reasons, one of the biggest traps that personalities fall into. They found a studio, blast all of their money on voice talent, trailers, marketing, and their egotistical vision. And then on the back end, not only is none of that vision realized and present, then at that point the money is also gone. Scope creep is nothing that we really have to talk about here in any shape or form, or I don't really need to elaborate on, but just look at Highguard, our most recent example. That game is literally trying to be one of those fake video games that you see running in the background of a movie. It just tries to be everything. It wants to be a raid, a MOBA, a battle royale. It has build crafting, it has large scale battle maps, siege. It wants to be a looter shooter. It is a hero shooter. It's the very definition of being an everything game that literally then pleases no one. And that is one of the biggest downfalls that these studios have. Doesn't matter how big the names are that are attached to these studios. It doesn't matter. If the team doesn't come together and work out, then no amount of vision can save a product. If you have incompetent developers in your team, no matter from which studio they come or how much of a pedigree their former studio has, these people, even though they might have been ex-Valve developers, cannot save the studio. That is the biggest problem. This is why you never should pay much attention to the marketing label of this game was made by former developers from Studio X. One example I want to highlight here as we are coming to the end is Ken Levine, famous for BioShock. Ken Levine now has his own studio, and there's already reports of development hell, struggles, and management issues. Whether or not these are true, obviously, we don't know. There's just been reports of people who said that the studio is struggling. The question here being, when Ken Levine was with Irrational Games, and this is the big question, and you already know what I'm hinting at, did he make BioShock great? Or was BioShock great independent of his influence, or was it even great despite his influence? Did he and only he primarily contribute? Or perhaps was it some sort of team effort? It's pretty clear what I'm aiming at, right? Games are usually never carried by the pedigrees or the accolades of a single person or a few notable people who might have been great at other studios. A video game is always carried by the studio and the team that makes the game. If there are issues within the team, it doesn't matter what the team consists of and how many great players you poach and put in that team. If they can't work together, or if they actually lack the skills that you have assumed that they have because they came from big companies, then you will never make a good product, a good final product, a good game. Because big names might sell, but big names don't necessarily make good games. And it remains to be seen if Ken Levine's new game will be a success, or fall to the same trappings like many other former industry leads did before him. In short, Ken Levine is very likely not going to be the primary reason why his game succeeds. And he isn't the primary reason why BioShock succeeded. It's because the studio and the team that made those games, they came together, they worked out. It's literally the original Bungie story. That original team that made Halo 1, 2, and 3. That overall conglomeration, that makeup of people that came together made it possible to make this game. It doesn't matter that Bungie still has the name Bungie attached to it. It does not consist of the same makeup that the original Bungie was. Therefore, we will not get another Halo. We will never get another Halo spiritual successor that is on the same level of quality, because that team composition doesn't exist anymore. And it's not just because there were original visionaries there that made it possible. That is also a reason, but it's because there was a team that had visionaries which worked together and were, by the way, crunching their asses off to make it possible. That is why these games were great. It's the same story with the old Star Wars trilogy, the original trilogy. That isn't just a masterpiece because of George Lucas. And similarly, the original prequels are a prime example why giving a single person full control over a franchise maybe didn't turn out to be the best idea, as it became evident that truly George Lucas wasn't the only reason why the original Star Wars trilogies were so beloved. Famously, he was reined in and helped out by many of his co-workers, friends and family, especially during the Empire Strikes Back's development, which is consistently considered to be one of the best original Star Wars movies. And I would argue it is definitely not due to George, but due to all the people surrounding him that the movie turned out the way it did. So, in the end, to summarize, I don't like the marketing strategy, the marketing argument or the marketing lie that former developers of big gaming industry names involved in a project equal out to it being a good game. If they don't work with a good team, or a lot of them turn out to not be great minds in the end, then their products are not going to work out. If it turns out that their former success was largely carried by a team effort, and not just by them alone, then they will never make a great game, because a great game is never just made on the shoulders of a single person's hard work. It's always a team effort. That's why we have gaming studios, unless you turn out to be an insane single person developer. Then the success that you made is literally all on your shoulders, but those are obviously exceptions, and it doesn't happen in the AAA and AA industry. And especially if these former devs literally have nothing else to show for themselves besides I did work for the studio, and we don't even know what position you were holding. This person could be anyone. They could have worked as any position in that studio. That is something nobody should take seriously. If this is on the box art, on the marketing material, in trailers, just ignore that. Just ignore it. It's just one of those tried out, tired out marketing tricks. But we obviously can't ignore exceptions to the rule. And as you've likely been screaming at me throughout the entire runtime of the video, there are indeed examples of former developers making a new team, forming a new studio, and then making a masterpiece. So I will talk about this shortly as well, because the logic here is the same. Expedition 33 is the obvious example, made by former Ubisoft employees and developers. The argument still remains the same. Do you think Expedition 33 turned out to be the way because it was simply made and set on the shoulders of those ex-Ubisoft developers? Solely because it was made by ex-Ubisoft developers? Or do you think it worked out to become a masterpiece because it was an entirely different team of unrestricted talent under new management with different funding, less management overhead, different team leads, structures, values, ideas, goals, and different visuals at the helm? I think that is what makes a studio and a game project great. It's the sum of all the things. You can't just have a visionary at the helm. That doesn't make a great game. It's been proven many times. You can't just poach famous developers from other studios and then hope they shit out a great game for you. That's never gonna work. So, in conclusion, we should largely ignore the made by former ex-person from big studio argument, because 9 out of 10, this management trick is a lie, or it's entirely irrelevant to the final product. If the studio's team doesn't work out, if the studio's lead head doesn't work out, the final game won't work out. And no amount of big industry personalities can save such a sinking ship. See you next time.